All right, welcome back. Today we'll be talking about AMSCO Chapter 12, which is all about territorial and economic expansion right before the Civil War, 1830 to 1860. Apologize for my outfit. It is quarantine, so I'm already dressed up for Halloween. Hopefully this won't be too much of a distraction. What we're going to be looking at today is kind of three main ideas. First, manifest destiny, which was the idea that the U.S. Americans believed it was their destiny to basically spread all across the continental U.S. And so that led to a lot of westward migration, but also a lot of conflict with other countries, especially Mexico. We will dig into the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, the causes and effects. We'll spend a whole day on that next week as well. And then we'll look at the impact of westward migration, the impact of manifest destiny on the West. So manifest destiny is an idea that I've talked about, but haven't actually officially defined yet. Manifest destiny was the belief that the US had a God-given right to spread all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So again, manifest destiny, their destiny was manifest. Their destiny was obvious, it was clear. And their destiny was to spread from the Atlantic coast, the 13 colonies. They're already pushing west. They're already going to the Midwest. They've already got the Louisiana Territory. But many Americans believed it was their God-given destiny or right to spread all the way to the Pacific coast, Oregon, California. And there were a lot of ideas and concepts associated with manifest destiny. There was certainly nationalism connected to that. A lot of Americans were incredibly nationalistic and believed that it was, America was the greatest country in the world, so it was their destiny to continue to grow as this great, powerful country. There's also a lot of population increase. Remember, in the early 1800s, the American population is doubling every 30 years. These people need land. Where can they get land? Well, they can get lots of cheap farmland in the West. And so that's one push for manifest destiny or westward migration. There's also rapid economic development, technological advances. Think about the transportation revolution, the roads, the railroads, and the canals and the turnpikes and whatnot. And then all of the growing industrial cities, not just in New England, but Chicago, Detroit, and farther west. So this economic growth, this development of a transportation infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads, encourages and allows westward migration. And so with manifest destiny, the US triples in size in the 19th century. It triples its territorial reach in the 1800s. But as the US expands in size, this constantly brings up the question of slavery. Should these new territories, which will eventually become states, should they be free or slave states? How will that affect the balance in Congress? And what happens to the native populations as the white settlers push west? And so this is a really famous painting of manifest destiny. America depicted almost like the Statue of Liberty. This pure white woman streaming across the western frontier with all of these settlers, small farmers who are just looking for a fresh start. You see the railroads over here pushing them west. You see the commerce over here that allows them to go west. And then we have these stereotypical horse-drawn carriages like the Oregon Trail. They were farmers. And then driving both the native population and driving the native animals like buffalo off of the land. And so to talk about this idea of manifest destiny, that is definitely a concept that we need to be familiar with, so I'll put it in bold. So the US had a God-given right to spread or to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, or all of the modern day US. This was connected to nationalism, it's connected to population increase, economic growth, and then all of the new transportation. But this led to questions about slavery and conflicts with the native population. Those questions about slavery is really going to be one of the key ideas that will eventually cause the Civil War. Now, the main conflict between the expanding United States and its western frontier, I suppose, was in Texas in a conflict with Mexico. Now, there's a lot of information here. Your textbook squeezes all of this into about a page, and so I will skim through it, but then I'll also highlight the most important details. In 1823, Mexico won its independence from Spain, and let me move my head up a little bit here. But most of the populated regions of Mexico were in central Mexico, around Mexico City and elsewhere. Texas, which was part of Mexico at the time, was sparsely populated. There weren't many people who lived there because that was all the way up in the northern frontier. It was far from Mexico City, far from kind of the centers of Mexican commerce. And so Mexico tried to encourage people to settle their province of Texas because there weren't many people living there. Some Mexicans certainly moved there, but a lot of Americans also realized that this was an opportunity to get some cheap land, basically, from Mexico. So Stephen F. Austin, who the city of Austin, Texas is named after him, he was an American, and he brought 300 white families to Texas from the US. This started kind of an early migration or a steady migration of Americans into Texas, so that by just a few years after independence, by 1830, Americans outnumbered Mexicans by a 3-to-1 ratio. So there were 75% Americans, 25% Mexicans living in the province of Texas. And you can see that was both white farmers and enslaved African Americans. Now, Mexico actually outlawed slavery, including in Texas, and they required all settlers, whether Mexican or American, to convert to Roman Catholicism. But these Americans that were flowing into Texas, they ignored both of those things. They did not convert to Catholicism, and they oftentimes brought their slaves with them. So this began a conflict between Mexico and Texas. Mexico closed Texas off to additional American settlers. The Americans said, screw you, I'm not going to listen to you. Americans kept on coming. They did not convert to Catholicism, and they oftentimes brought their slaves with them. So long story short, this leads to a dispute specifically between Mexico and its province of Texas. And in 1836, Sam Houston, again, the city of Houston, Texas is named after him. He rebels and he declares Texas an independent republic called the Lone Star Republic, or the Republic of Texas. If you've ever wondered why the Texas state flag has one big star on it, it's because it was called the Lone Star Republic. So long story short, after Mexico wins its independence, lots of Americans move to Texas to settle there. They bring their slavery with them. This leads to a dispute between Mexico and Texas. So Texas rebels. Remember, Texas is mostly white Americans, 75% or so. They rebel, and Texas declares that they are independent from Mexico. Let me add this in here real quick. So again, with the causes, we have many American settlers move to Texas. They bring slavery with them. That leads to a conflict with the Mexican government, who says you have to convert to Catholicism and also no slavery. And then eventually Texas rebels, and they become the Lone Star Republic. They become their own independent nation. Now, the Texans actually wanted to become part of the United States. Sam Houston, who was the president of Texas, Houston's named after him, he actually applied to the US for statehood several times in the 30s and 40s, but was actually denied by the US, largely over concerns about conflict with Mexico, but then also about the question of slavery. So it isn't until 1845 when the US finally tries to fully annex Texas. Annex means to make it part of the United States. President James Polk sends a special envoy to Mexico City to first settle the border dispute with Texas. Where is the border? I'll show you a couple of the ideas in a map in a moment. and then also to try to buy California and New Mexico from the US. Mexico refused to sell California and Texas. They also said that the border with Texas they refused to sell California and New Mexico. They also said the border between Texas and Mexico was much higher than it really was, which led to war. So again, in 1845, let's see, the US President Polk tries to purchase California, New Mexico from Mexico. Mexico refuses, and this is what ultimately leads to war. The US tried to buy land from Mexico. The Mexicans refused, and so the US said, fine, I'm just going to take it by force, essentially. So Mexican-American War, 1840s, is caused largely by US territorial expansion. Just to clarify that, US territorial expansion leads to war with Mexico. To look at the maps here, we see what the United States looks like in the 1840s. So again, they are more than just the 13 colonies. They've pushed west quite a bit into the Midwest. Remember, they added Missouri in 1820. This line right here, that was the Missouri Compromise line. There's supposed to be no slavery above that line. This was unorganized territory from the Louisiana Purchase, and this was Oregon country. There was a dispute with England over who controlled that. This all here was Mexico. And so during the Mexican-American War, again, you can kind of see where the laws are drawn. My bad. This was the Republic of Texas. This was the Lone Star Republic, much smaller than Texas is today. And this land over here was still controlled by Mexico. You can see Texas claimed it for themselves. And so in addition to the US trying to purchase California and New Mexico, there was a border dispute. Where is the border between Texas and Mexico? And so this map shows really well where the two possible borders were. Mexico claimed the border was up here at the Nueces River, whereas the United States claimed that the border between Texas and Mexico was in the Rio Grande River. I can't see my mouse. Oh well. The Rio Grande River down here. So that's about, I don't know, 200 miles to the south. And so the Americans sent their troops from the Nueces River, Corpus Christi today, all the way down to the Rio Grande to push the Mexicans back and to try to claim that border at the Rio Grande, which means the Americans would gain more land. And so ultimately, and again, we're going to explore the Mexican-American War much more in class. We'll look at it from kind of the Mexican-American perspective, or the Mexican perspective. The US wins the war. They force the Mexicans to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which recognizes the Rio Grande as the border between the US and, between Texas and Mexico, eventually the US and Mexico. So again, this much more southern border, this becomes the border between Mexico and Texas, which it is today. The US also, when they won this war, they also forced the Mexicans to sell them California and New Mexico, which they had demanded earlier for $15 million, same price that we bought the Louisiana territory for back in 1803. I'm going to pause here real quick. When we talk about the effects of the war, I'll put this treaty in bold because it's an important one. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo says that the border is along the Rio Grande River like it is today, and the US buys California and New Mexico for $15 million. So again, if you look back at this map, they purchased this tract of land over here. Now, the question immediately became, would Texas be a slave state or not? And so there was a bill that almost passed the Congress called the Wilmot Proviso, which would have made slavery acquired from Mexico legal. This passed the House of Representatives twice, but failed to pass the Senate. Sorry, that's there's a big typo there. This actually would have forbid slavery. This is awkward. Would have made slavery illegal in the territory. I was very confused when I was reading that. And so basically, Texas quite possibly is going to become a slave state based off of this failed Wilmot Proviso. So the Wilmot Proviso tries to ban slavery in Texas, but it fails. So will Texas become a slave state, and will this lead to future conflict? The U.S. also buys a little bit more land called the Gadsden Purchase, modern day New Mexico and parts of Utah, I suppose, to build a railroad through there. And so you can see right down here, sorry, Arizona, New Mexico. So you can see from this map, this is the land that the U.S. wins from the Mexican-American War. This is the Rio Grande River down here where the border becomes. This is what the U.S. purchases from Mexico for $15 million, the Mexican cession. This is the extra piece of land that the U.S. purchased from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase for $10 million. And that was specifically to build a railway line out to the west. And so you can see the Mexican-American War pretty drastically increases the size of the U.S. In the 1840s and 1850s. The U.S. gains this massive tract of lands down here, probably 25% of American territory. And Mexico obviously loses that land as well. A little bit more before we start to wrap up. There was also another land conflict with Oregon. To go back here, the Oregon Territory, there was a dispute as to whether this was controlled by the US or Great Britain, England. This shows it really well as well, where it was unclear kind of where the border was, if the border would be along this parallel here or higher. This shows that disputed territory as well. Now, lots of different countries had claimed Oregon over the years. Spain had claimed it at one point, but gave it up in 1819. Russia claimed some portions, at least up in Alaska, before we bought it in 1867, what's called Seward's Folly. England claimed parts of it because they had a lot of fur trade with the natives, but there were very few British settlers who lived in the Oregon Territory, which is going to kind of weaken their claim. And then the US claimed that it was theirs because, well, first of all, the US discovered, quote unquote, the Oregon Territory with the Lewis and Clark expedition and whatnot. The US also had a lot of fur trading in the Oregon Territory. And there were thousands of settlers who lived in the Oregon Territory as well. They traveled westward from the Midwest to Oregon along what's called the Oregon Trail that hopefully we'll explore a little bit next week as well. And so there had been lots of disputes over the Oregon Territory over the years. And by the mid-1800s, the dispute is really, where's the border? And what is the US control? What is England control? This starts kind of a fight in the US called 5440 or fight. 5440 was the parallel that a lot of Americans believe should be theirs. Let me show a map of that real quick. Yeah. So this is the 5440 parallel up here, way, 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 way up into what would now be Canada, and then the southern tip of Alaska. So Americans said 5440 or fight. We want all the land or nothing. Now, through some negotiations with the British, they negotiated a little bit, and they agreed with the 49th parallel. So if you know your Pacific Northwest geography, Seattle's right down here. Vancouver, British Columbia is up here. So this is now the border between the US and Canada, and all of this became US land, modern day Oregon and Washington. So let me add a little bit of details here on Oregon. So conflicts over the Oregon Territory. We have this 5440 or fight, which was when Americans fought for the Oregon Territory from Britain. And then after negotiations, US gained control of modern-day Oregon and Washington. Again, to go back to this map, because I think that this really shows how much the US is expanding. You've got the 13 colonies over here. They expanded over to here. Louisiana Purchase gives them this dotted territory here. The Mexican-American War gives them this bluish territory here. The Mexican Cession, that purchase, gives them this purchase to the southwest. And then after negotiations with England, we gained the Oregon Territory up here. So the US is increasing quite significantly over the 1840s and 1850s. Now, in the background of all of this was another presidential election in 1844, where the Democrat, James Polk, became the winner. Very long story short, the Democrats, remember that was Jackson's political party. The Democrats were supposed to be all about small federal government and helping the people. Again, think about Jackson and how he was a man of the people, so he fashioned himself. There was a lot of disagreement between the Democrats. The Northern Democrats, their candidate was Martin Van Buren, and he did not want Texas to be annexed. He did not want Texas to become a state because he knew that it would become a slave state. The Southern Democratic candidate was John C. Calhoun, who was pro-slavery, pro-annexation. He wanted Texas to become a slave state. And so you can already see, 17 years before the Civil War, that there are splits, even within the Democratic Party, there are splits between the North, anti-slavery, and the South, pro-slavery. After a deadlock at the Democratic National Convention, when neither Van Buren nor Calhoun could get the majority, the Democrats nominated James K. Polk, who became the president, who was firmly committed to expansion and manifest destiny. So I'll actually add this as a review in a minute. Henry Clay, who was the guy who wrote the American System, that infrastructure system, he was the Whig nominee, but never really took a side. He kind of was wishy-washy, went back and forth on whether he was in favor of annexing Texas, which kind of lost a lot of his support. So James K. Polk, the Democrat, wins. And so what is all of this? What effect does all of this have? Let me just add this here. So all of this like massive territorial expansion in the 1840s and 1850s, what does that lead to? Well, that leads to Texas, that leads to the American Southwest, and it leads to the Northwest, the Oregon Territory. The Southwest, that was the Mexican Cession. And then Texas, that was the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. So massive territorial expansion. And this, not surprisingly, is also going to lead to massive westward migration as Americans begin to settle these new this new western frontier. Americans quickly passed through the Great Plains region to get towards California and Oregon, which is much more fertile land. Now, there were some fur traders who had already settled there that were able to kind of set up and help out these new settlers. And the Oregon Trail is probably the most famous example of this westward migration, going from Missouri all the way to California and Oregon. When I was in elementary school, I mean, video games existed, but that was like the Super NES back when I was in elementary school. And so what every single kid played is we played Oregon Trail on the computer. I really hope you guys have played Oregon Trail. You got to create your family. You got to name all of the people in your party. You would buy all the stuff that you need, and then you would set out along the Oregon Trail. And every single day there'd be some conflict. You might have to ford a river, and maybe when you try to cross the river, you lose some of your possessions. There's a moment where you go out into the frontier to hunt buffalo, and no matter how many buffalo you shot, you could only carry back like 20-30 pounds of buffalo, which kind of told the story of overhunting, which led to the near extinction of many animals in the western frontier. And then if you played the game Oregon Trail, people would always die. It was actually very rare to actually win the game. Most of the time you would die before you ever got there. And so that game did a really good job when I was a kid, when I was in elementary school, of teaching about the westward migration. They would use horse-pulled wagons, just covered by canopy. They go about 15 miles a day. But there was the prospect, if they made it to the west, of both mining and farming. Mining, I mean, we hopefully know about the American Gold Rush in 1848, and then 1849 was when the big rush happened. That's why the 49ers are called the 49ers. And then other silver and gold rushes in Colorado, Nevada, the Dakotas, and other Western territories. So massive westward migration to the west because of trying to get gold and silver. You see that there was also a huge migration of Chinese immigrants to the west, to the Pacific, which we will explore those tensions between white settlers and Chinese immigrants as we continue to look at this course. And then there was also, in addition to the prospect of striking it rich, of finding gold and silver, there was just cheap farmland in the West as well. So there's lots of westward migration. The Oregon Trail is kind of the famous example of this. And then there was kind of the prospects of silver and gold, and then cheap farmland. And all of those innovations in transportation that we talked about a couple of chapters ago, roads, canals, or really railroads, those are spreading west as well. And so what we have by 1850, 1860 is a ever-growing, ever-expanding United States that's expanding territorially, but that's also expanding economically. And the US began to trade with the rest of the world much more. The US, especially from New England, began to trade across the Atlantic pretty regularly to Europe. All those disputes with England that caused the War of 1812, those have been settled at this point. There's also a huge demand for whale oil, which was what candles and lanterns burnt. That led to a huge whaling boom, literally killing whales to get their fat to create candles and lanterns. That led to a huge whale hunting industry in New England. There was also improvements in ship design. It used to take about 6 months to sail from New York to California, because they had to go all the way under the southern tip of South America because the Panama Canal wasn't built yet. Now it takes 3 months, my bad. So they cut that in half. So yeah, new ships, steam ships created by Robert Fuller that were much quicker, they could carry more, and they were cheaper. And then Commodore Matthew Perry also led a ship to Japan. Japan had been a very isolated nation and had refused to trade with other nations, and the US basically forces Japan to trade with us. And so there's also kind of just growing foreign commerce. There's trade with Europe, there's trade with Latin America, and trade with Japan as the US continues to expand. All right, putting this up here for us to finish up. The big question that we're going to explore when we move towards chapters 13, 14, 15, and whatnot, which is the causes of the Civil War and the Civil War. We're going to explore how these events that we're seeing here are laying the seed, laying the groundwork for the eventual Civil War. And we can see it here. Will Texas become a slave state? We see it in the election of 1844, that dispute between Martin Van Buren and John Calhoun over whether the Democratic Party will be pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And as the US continues to expand, will these new territories be free or slave? None of these conflicts have been solved, and so it's just kicking the can down the road until there will be eventually a civil war, 1861 to 65, to finally settle that dispute.